Gwadzi, my name is Deborah Jackson Taffa, and I am speaking to you today from Santa Fe, New Mexico. This is my ancestral homelands. I grew up in a little town called Farmington that's up in the Four Corners, and I am from Laguna Pueblo, the Badger Clan, and the Yuma Nation with the Keepers of the Water Clan. And today I'm going to be speaking to you as a memoirist. And I know that, there are so many interesting things that go into creating and writing a memoir. We could talk about a lot of craft things, the balance of exposition, summary, scene, interiority, and dialogue. We could talk about the art of making transitions between these components, or the timing and pacing in a story, when to use the way things were as a mode of storytelling versus the power of one time. But I decided to land today instead on this idea of the double perspective, which is me. I am both me sitting at the desk as an author writing my story. Simultaneously, I am me at the age I am in the story, reliving experiences for and with my reader. So, just as we're getting started, I'm going to start us with a little warm up exercise. But in the name of camaraderie, I would love it if you dropped into the chat where you're calling in from today, what part of the country you're in, and possibly your pronouns, so that your classmates can see and we can have a little bit of a feeling of community despite the distance through our computers. So today we're going to talk about creating a persona for yourself on the page. So I talk often when I speak about memoir as our identity as a stack of nesting dolls. There are many versions of me, and at each stage of my life, I have been reborn and I have become someone new. We think about this a lot when we're writing memoirs. We think about who we were at a given place in time, how to write very close to that body, cast ourselves into a position in a world that we no longer see on a day-to-day basis. The same, and at the same time, we're dropping authorial wisdom about that experience. We're telling people what we've learned in the time that has transpired between when we were that character on the page and who we are now. So, one of my basic beliefs about creating art is that art is arrangement, art is artifice. Part of what I'm doing is I'm taking a three-dimensional self and I'm flattening it on the page for my reader. I get to tell what I want to tell, and I get to hold off and keep secret that I don't want to share. And that is one of the most important things to remember as a memoirist, because it's empowering, right? There can remain inside of you a sacred place that other people don't have access to, because you are the one who's arranging and creating the artifice and the magic for your reader. So again, we're going to start with something that tries to place us in a time. I'm going to read this poem to you. And as I read it, I want you to close your eyes and think about what the speaker is saying for our exercise, okay? By John Ashbery. The room I entered was a dream of this room. Surely all those feet on the sofa were mine. The oval portrait of a dog was me at an early age. Something shimmers. Something is hushed up. We had macaroni for lunch every day, except Sunday when a small quail was induced to be served to us. Why do I tell you these things? You are not even here. You are not, you are not even here. Open your eyes and read through the poem that's on the screen for you for just a moment. I want to take a moment to call attention to the ritual that is writing. When we write, excluding what we do on Facebook or social media, which is a hot take in response to somebody else in live time. When we sit down to write literature, when we sit down to write our memoir or our book, we are basically understanding that we are human beings with finite lives seeking to write beyond the boundary of death, to communicate what it means to be us in a singular time, but that the magic of this thing that we do busts down the temporal walls. It can harken back to an ancestral, to our ancestors, and it can speak to our grandchildren who are yet unborn. I want you to really hone in for just a minute on that thing that John Ashbery does with this very short, magical poem, right? In the end, he says, "Why do I tell you these things? You are not even here." By the time a book arrives in our lap, the author could be dead. By the time a book arrives in our laps, the author is definitively a different person than the person they were when they wrote the words that we're receiving, right? There's a magic in writing. And so when you sit down to write, when I sit down to write, we think of it as a ritual that has to do with more than our day-to-day lives, right? We're creating a trust and an intimacy with our reader. We are saying that we can purchase a body. We can make somebody's hair stand up on their arms from a great distance, a temporal distance, perhaps even from beyond death. We can access a person's body and make them have a visceral and felt experience of our world, right? So to start us off today, I would just love it if you would just take a moment, pull out a pen, and I'm just going to give you a few minutes to envision a room that you remember being in at some point in time, a room that was important to you, and to capture the details. Nothing is insignificant. What do you see there? What's on the walls? What's on the floor? Is there a couch? Just jot some notes down. And it does not have to be in full sentences. It does not have to be linear. It's just something that you're imagining. While you do that, I will reread the poem for you, okay? And just keep your pen moving. The room I entered was a dream of this room. Surely all those feet on the sofa were mine. The oval portrait of a dog was me at an early age. Something shimmers. Something is hushed up. We had macaroni for lunch every day, except Sunday, when a small quail was induced to be served to us. Why do I tell you these things? You are not even here. Just take a few more moments to write. Awesome. And if you can unmute yourself, I'm not sure if this is possible in this Zoom room, but I would love to hear some things that people saw in their room as they envision this space that they once inhabited. Can people call out shimmers, dust, a couch, whatever it was you saw as you were envisioning this ritual space?
Black box theater.
Anyone else?
Swivel chairs.
Couches covered in thick, shiny plastic.
Oh, that's a good one. These are all good. Keep going. Somebody else.
Worn blue velveteen sofa.
Mhm. Teenage intentionality.
Mm. Honey wood floors.
Honey
Doll-
wood floors.
Dollhouse on a chipped white table.
Anyone else?
Collage of cousins on a wood paneled wall.
Changing behind the sofa because it's the only room in the house that had heat.
Okay, there's a feeling even of like the weather in that one. Yeah. Anyone else? We'll have two more.
The couch with grease stains, for people's heads.
An ironing board that folded out of the wall.
Beautiful. Okay, that's wonderful. So on one hand now we have this concept of setting, and I don't want to let that go. I just want to kind of set it aside, and perhaps we'll return to it later in class. Um, But for right now, I will say that when we are working in the one time and we're thinking about a scene or a setting or a place, when we're world building and we're creating this vision of with details and things and objects from the world, right? we're doing something that comes, I think, natural to a lot of people. Um, the harder part is figuring out then how to foreground ourselves and make ourselves an actor in that scene, right? How do we do that? How do we decide who we are? It's such an important part of memoir. Um, because it gives us the chance to portray ourselves while conveying the sophisticated wisdom of our current self, the adult narrator sitting at the table, the wise one who can make sort of a Whitman-esque statement about the world and about how we've grown via our experiences. And it's the second perspective, the author's retrospective employment of a more mature intelligence to interpret the past, that is really important to me, right? It's not merely an obligation, but a privilege, an opportunity. In any autobiographical narrative, whether memoir or the personal essay, the heart of the matter shines through those passages where the writer is analyzing the meaning of his or her experience, the quality of thinking, the depth of insight, and the willingness to wrest as much understanding as the writer is humanly capable of arriving at. These are the guarantees to the reader that an author's sensibility is trustworthy. With me, it goes further. I'm very, very attracted when I read as a reader to see those passages where my students or other authors, where their writing takes an analytical or an interpretive turn, because that is where you really get the rewards. I feel like I couldn't sit with a kid. Like if you're telling me a story of who you are at the age of 10 years old, I doubt that I would be interested to stay with your voice the entire time. I can laugh at the foibles and the fun of the 10-year-old, but it's you at the desk, the person who has the double perspective to tell me how to shape why it's important what you're telling me about this kid. That is really the gold in what I am interacting with, right? So I think one of the first things that I like to point out to memoirists is that you want to honor your life and your experiences without judgment. A mistake that we often make as beginning memoirists is that we think that we're telling a cautionary tale, right? Look what I've done wrong. You don't want to do it too. That's not important at all to me as a reader. Um, or we strain to be likable. We don't want to admit the ways in which we have failed, rather than accepting responsibility for our part in the problems that we had in our life. We want to point fingers and blame other people. It doesn't come across as mature, right? So we think a lot about how we can be kind to ourselves, how we can portray ourselves as multifaceted individuals who are a combination of halo and black hat. And we want to extend that same freedom, that same humanity, that same well-roundedness to the other people who inhabit our stories, right? That's extremely important. Otherwise, we're going to come up with flat characters, right? When we try to crown someone with a halo and we say, oh, our mother was a saint, she did everything right, it's very hard for her to be realistic. When we think about anti heroes in film, for example, I like to use the example of Han Solo. He's such a likable rogue character. And why is that? It's because he does a lot of terrible things, but he has one golden rule that he has to ascribe to that makes him lovable, and that's he can't turn his back on his friends. He goes back. It's okay for us to show people in our and ourselves as well, having a lot of failing attributes. If we can also make it complex by kind of showing the few golden lights, the few good things about people as well, make them all mixes. This is not new. This isn't anything that I'm sure you've heard this before, but I want to do a quick writing exercise with you that may help you kind of move in the direction of identifying themes and events that will be interesting and complex on the page, right? So let's take a few minutes again to pull out our pieces of paper and our pen. And I don't want you to think about this. I don't want you to take a long time to consider what you're writing. I want you to, as quickly as possible, write a list of fears. It can be clowns, cancer, car accidents, whatever you want it to be. The important thing is write as fast as you can. See if you can come up with 30 or 40 in the next minute. Just keep writing quickly, quickly. A list of things that make you afraid. Awesome. Let's go ahead and pause on that and let's switch to part 2 of this exercise. And again, the exact same thing. It doesn't have to be full sentences. It's a list. We're just making a list. Bullet point, as fast as you can. Make a list of accomplishments for which you are proud. A list of accomplishments for which you are proud. Okay, and the last one more list. Same exact thing, bullet points, no complete sentences. Things that make you angry. Things that make you angry. Excellent. Very good. Wind it down just another couple of seconds. And can I hear from you all? Can you unmute yourself and tell me if, just shout out, was one of those lists easier, faster to write than another?
The fears one was faster somehow.
The fears one was faster. Okay, anybody else? I love hearing that. That's so interesting.
Yeah, my fears was faster for me as well.
Your fears was faster for you as well? Okay.
Accomplish.
Somebody said accomplishments, the price?
Yeah.
Aha, okay.
Faster than fear. I had to think about it.
Okay.
Anger.
Anger. Anger. Well, especially right now, I'm not surprised in society that angers would make us. There's a lot to be angry about right now in the world. Yeah. Um, I think that I talked when we started class about how when I sit down to write, I often think about creating a ritual space. And, I think for some people that could be lighting a candle, or I have a friend who sits on a stoop in Brooklyn and looks for a certain combination of numbers and letters on license plates because he feels like then he's in conversation with an ancestral world before he goes inside. Anything that steps us outside of the mundane while at the same time helping us remember the quotidian, like the miracle of daily life, the miracle of what it means to put a pen to the paper and think that this thing could live beyond us once we're in our grave. It could reach people and tell people what it meant to be you in 2024. It's this incredible technology that we have writing. But I think a big part of what we learn to do when we identify who we are is find our voice. And so many of us have been silenced in our worlds. We're not meant to speak. If the world had its way, if old partners or old teachers or perhaps parents or religious leaders in our communities had their ways, they would have made us they would have made us ashamed of what we had to offer the world. And a big part of learning to write is developing a voice that says, I'm rebellious enough, I'm bold enough, I'm courageous enough to tell my story in a way that is unfettered. And so I think it's really important to reach for those things that create deep emotion in us. And so, in that spirit, because I think it makes us feel less lonely when we read literature, because we understand that other people are, in fact, going through very much similar things that we are. And that's so helpful to us. Let's go round robin and have people just one at a time call out what are the fears you have on the page and try to have several people call out some fears that they wrote down on the page just so that people can hear that they're similar to the ones they wrote. Yeah, it doesn't have to be in any order. Just call them out like you did with the room poem that we did.
War.
Strangers.
Dictate.
Silence. Dad without a beard.
My dog dying.
Okay. Anyone else?
Aloneness.
I'll say rejection. Let's go back in and look at that list of fears and circle any fear that feels like it has more to it, that there's a backstory, that there's an event, that there was a catalyst moment when that fear for you took hold. Circle any of them that have that spirit behind it. Is there a story there? Jot out a few lines if it feels like there might be a story there, right? You can jump over the list of angers or prides and ask yourself if there's something on that list that feels contradictory to you. Is there a contradiction in it somehow? Is there something that surprises you about one of the words that you've listed, one of the things that you've put on your list? Circle it. And I want you all to meditate for a moment as well, not only on whether or not there are stories, personal essays, bits of memoir that could be written from these things, right? But also reflecting on why perhaps one list was easier for you to write than another. Is it that you are too hard on yourself as a character and you don't want to celebrate your accomplishments? Is it that you're afraid of sounding like you're too prideful? Um, Do the fears scare you that much that you have a hard time being bold? I often say that writing creative nonfiction should give you the same feeling that you get when you stand at the edge of a cliff and you're getting ready to jump, 15 feet down into the water. It makes you want to jump up from your desk and run away because you're tapping on something, you're pressing on something that is a wound inside of you, that is affecting you. Charles Reznikov, the famous documentarian poet, said the difference between art and journalism is the extent to which the artist is wounded by the facts, right? Are we getting at things that have heart and that are more than a pulpit or a podium for us to talk, but that they somehow reflect back on ourselves and sort of reveal our own woundedness and challenge us to grow? Okay. So keep these lists, add to these lists, keep asking yourself whether or not you're engaging in the aspects of your life that are concerning enough to you, contradictory, scary, whatever it may be that's embedded in there for you. Are you addressing the things that need to be addressed? And then one last final tip about how maybe to expand these later. One of the hardest things about writing a book length collection is the connective tissue. We don't know where the power of one time goes a lot of times, right? We're threading together summary, scene, dialogue, exposition, interiority, reflection. It all becomes very jumbled. When you're starting out, it behooves you to begin with one time, one place, one day. Who was there? What are the objects in this world? What happened? What was the event? How did it make you feel in a simple one line statement at the end? Collect several of those scenes and don't worry about how they connect to other scenes in the book. When you have 12 to 15 of them, you have all these jigsaw puzzle pieces that you can lay out around you and figure out how to start interweaving and making a more complex narrative arc or a longer essay if that's what you're going for. So on the left of this slide, we see what we did. I talked about digging deep for material that's really going to count: fears, angers, prides. Another way I talk about this is to say to people, imagine that tomorrow, God forbid, you lost your best friend, the person with whom you are the closest in the world, the person who you run to when you're having big problems in your life. They're just gone. And you had to create that intimacy, right? That true intimacy and vulnerability with somebody else. That person with whom you were just starting to create intimacy with, the new person that you're trying to get to know, there would be stories that they would have to know about you. Otherwise, they would not understand what it was that makes you tick in this world. What is it that makes you you, right? We have aspects of our identity that are built around events, really important things that we endured and survived, or that good or bad. I use the word traumatic when I teach a lot of times, meaning good and bad trauma, anything that traumatizes the brain enough that we remember it. Because think about how much of our lives we forget. If I asked you today what you did last year exactly at this hour, you couldn't tell me that you walked down the hall to get a bag of Cheetos out of the vending machine, right? We have these heightened moments. And are you working towards those in order to create true intimacy with your reader? On the right, I just want to highlight some of the things that we work with as memoirists, because people often think that we're just working in memory, and you have so many tools available to you. You have photos. You can go back and interview people. I hope that you interview your elders if before they're gone. I don't know how I would have written my book if I hadn't interviewed all of my grandfather's sisters while they were still living and I was back home on the reservation. You have artifacts. You can go dig through old trunks in your attic. You can look through your loved ones who are gone. You can look through their personal effects and see where the artifacts of their lives point to. What do these stories tell, right? You have straight up research, which is reading other books and figuring out what you're an expert in and how that aligns with your life. It could be anything from indigenous languages to cooking to child psychology. Make a list of categories that you feel like you have an expertise in, right? Nobody wants to read a memoir that's just, it's hard to write a memoir that's just about you. You're really dealing in psychological development, in your own development when you do that. It's also possible to thread in the world, right? Remember that a great memoir tells you what happens, but a really exceptional memoir tells you what happens and it tells you how the world pressured that individual into becoming who they were. None of us are created in a vacuum, right? Mysteries is a really big one. So, are there stories about your parents or your grandparents or anybody in your life that you're not exactly, you don't know really what happened, and you could go dig and try to find out unanswered questions closely related to that. Splinters, that get under your skin because you can't understand. That is fertile ground for an essayist or a memoirist. And then again, the things on the left, the things that really charge us emotionally, so that that charge might kind of go onto the page and affect our reader and make them want to read what we have written. So let's move on. I'm going to read this quote by Philip Lopate, who is an author and a writer that I studied with, and he's a big part of my literary education. The problem with I is not that it's in bad taste, but that fledgling personal essayists may think they've said or conveyed more than they have with that one syllable. In their minds, that I is swarming with background and a lush, sticky past, and almost too fatal specificity, whereas the reader, encountering it for the first time in a new piece, sees only a slender telephone pole standing in a sentence, trying to catch a few signals to send on, right? So, like I've talked about today, many MFA programs, creative nonfiction programs, memoir classes talk about this need to create a self that transcends stereotypes, that moves beyond the trope of what people would think someone like you would be like, right? And so you come in and you continually think about how you can create a complex and contradictory character that doesn't feel flat on the page. And just to highlight how common this is, I'm going to share a writing exercise that was written by a friend of mine named, you guys all know Leslie Jameson. She came out to Santa Fe to teach my students here, and she gave them this writing prompt. I want you to scribble a few notes for it. No, again, you don't have to make it very ornate. It's just an example of you can use it later if you want to. Imagine yourself as a guest house with many rooms. Make a list of selves, past and present, who occupy these rooms. Push yourself to create selves that are as different as possible in moods, habits, ways of being and speaking. List as many details as you can about each version of the self you describe. Take a few notes. Again, anytime I do prompts, I don't push myself even to write full sentences sometimes. It just depends on what's coming. Just write whatever you need to remember what you're thinking right now. This is where I get when I talk about the nesting doll and I think about the many selves that I have, right? We think of master identities and minor identities. We think, well, I'm a mother, I'm a swimmer, I am a professor, I'm an arts administrator. I am, say you have a religion, I'm a Catholic. I am an enrolled tribal member of Laguna Pueblo. I have all these aspects of myself, right? That's what they try to get us to think about oftentimes when we read books on how to create nonfiction. I want to complicate this a little bit, though. So Vivian Gornick, she talked a lot about master and minor identities in her book, The Situation in the Story. And here's a quote from her that talks about how until we know who is speaking, right, in any given essay, we don't really know what it is that we're trying to say. So she tells a story about going to a funeral, and the person who gives the eulogy is so incredibly on point, way more so than any of the other people who speak at this funeral. And that's who she's speaking about in this quote. The speaker never lost sight of why she was speaking, or perhaps more important, of who was speaking. Again, lending to the idea that we have different identities from which we might speak. Of the various selves at her disposal, she was, after all, many people: a daughter, a lover, a bird watcher, a New Yorker. She knew and didn't forget that the only proper self to invoke was the one that had been apprenticed to the woman who died. Because the narrator knew who was speaking, she also knew why she was speaking, right? And I remember when I studied with Philip, and he told us this really interesting story about having an essay that he could not finish. It was a really hard essay for him to finish. I think it took almost 20 years. I've had a few essays like that myself that took like a decade to finish. And oftentimes I gather the problem is that we don't know who is speaking. And so Philip told a story with his that was essentially that his mother had had sort of a problematic reputation in their neighborhood when he was growing up. There were rumors about her having an affair. And he wrote about all this, of course, later. When he was first trying to write about it, he had such a hard time getting his hands around it. He was writing it as a son, I gather. And then one day he said, as he was getting older, he remembered his father coming home from work and kind of being depressed and sitting on the couch. And he thought, I'm happy that my mother, if any of that is true, I'm happy that my mother found happiness where she could, wherever she, she found companionship. If in fact she did find companionship, it warms my heart. And of course, the shift that was made there was that he didn't see his mother as his mother, like a woman that he put on a pedestal and sort of owned as his, but as a woman who he had objective distance, and he wanted to imagine her as happy. That really influenced me hearing that story, because I realized that, Vivian Gornick, what she says is absolutely right. Sometimes I'm trying to write as a daughter when I should be writing from the vantage point of a sister and being the sister. Or sometimes I'm trying to envision my father as somebody who I want to put on a pedestal, when actually, if I think of him as sort of a working class man who's a welder of a certain generation, and I kind of take myself out of that place as a daughter, and I'm thinking more of it maybe in a more analytical way, I'm able to free him up in my rendition of him in a way that gives me a breakthrough, right? So I want to point that out at the same time that I want to share a story with you about how all of this talk and this insistence on finding my nesting dolls, my former versions of self, and my master and minor identities kind of got me in trouble in my early career, because I'm a very intersectional person. So when I first studied with Mr. Lopate, and when I first went to Iowa to get my MFA program, I was inundated with all of this information about trying to create like complex and contradictory characters of myself on the page, that I got this in my head that I wanted to draw from all of my history at once, that I wanted to draw from all of the cultural traditions I felt influenced by as a contemporary Native American woman at once. I'm an American citizen. I'm a dual national married to a man from Milan, Italy, who I met in Bali, Indonesia when I was 20, right? I'm a woman with biracial children in a family that switches between English and Italian. My kids feel as comfortable at the Uffizi as they do at Pueblo feast days or powwows. And I thought I was going to jam all of this in the book because I wanted to transcend cultural scripts, destroy stereotypes, and make room for the many selves I had inside. And so I kept asking myself, how do I reveal my multiplicity? Because my aim was to subvert expectations and do something that was very rich. I was thinking of myself as a chorus, right, with all these nesting dolls emerging at once. My early drafts, kind of in this vein, would always use I would rely on my persona at the desk. I was me, the writer, and then I would try to scope back. Whereas the book that I ended up writing, it's from my childhood forward. It's a coming of age. There's a difference, right? I would start these essays from my desk, and I was not interested in writing a coming of age when I first started writing. I told myself that I was going to write all the rushing nesting dolls inside of me at once and come across as this contemporary Native woman, right? And so one of my first essays I remember that I took to class was a piece that was it was the setting. We talked about the room at the beginning, you ground people in a place. It was in an olive garden in Italy at my in-laws farm. And from there, this all really happened. This neighbor came over and he asked me where I was from. And I told him, well, I was born on an Indian reservation in the southwestern part of the United States. And he could not, maybe because of my ethnically ambiguous appearance, or maybe because he had never met a Native American person before, he couldn't believe, he had a very hard time accepting that I was actually Native American. And so the essay starts in the Olive Garden, it introduces the neighbor, and then it flashes back to my childhood where I reference the poverty and some of the alcoholism that I had seen growing up on the Yuma Kwatsaan Indian Reservation in Arizona. And after workshop, my professor pulled me aside and he was like, "You seem like a well-spoken professional woman. Are you sure that you aren't playing the race card with this bit about the alcohol?" And I was like, I was stunned because I was doing, I thought, what they told me I should do. And I love this professor. So I'm not trying to complain about this encounter. What it did for me was basically, I kind of at the time, what I realized was that based on my sort of successful appearance as a woman in her late 30s, he didn't read me as someone who grew up on a violent or poor Native American reservation. Um, And secondly, despite the lack of Native memoirs, which leads to a lack of middle class narratives written by Native people, this professor wanted to believe that I had a middle class upbringing based on my appearance, which, I suppose he didn't want to believe that all Native American people endure poverty and problems, right? And perhaps he felt that I was deploying a cultural script that was to gain pathos or using a story that wasn't my own because I thought it would be popular. And this might feel insulting or weird, but his assumption that there are many professional Native people, especially in younger generations, who have had far less trauma than I did growing up, was kind of a generosity on his part. You can see that, right? I could admit it. I know many Native professionals, and I hope to read a lot more books that are about middle class struggles in our population being published by us someday. But at the time, what this taught me was I immediately saw all the ways in which my life story and narrative both broke the cultural script, even as in other ways, it kind of illustrated common tropes. And more importantly, it taught me a lot about the representation in publishing, what my persona was going to mean on the page. I understood suddenly that for somebody with a very intersectional identity like mine, it was going to be really hard for readers to take it all in. And in fact, when I left my MFA program and I started to query agents to try to get this book that I had written that was full scope, full Russian nesting doll, not the coming of age, but the mixture of an adult voice with a childhood voice with everything kind of mixed in, I kept getting the same comment, which was, your writer doesn't know how to place you. There's not a cohesive through line. We think you should split the book in apart and just do the childhood story without the adult narrative. Um, Almost like I had to create some sort of street cred with people to kind of prove that I was native in all the stereotypical ways that they expect to see a native story on the page. Um, and I say this because I think that a lot of times MFA programs and writing programs treat the creation of a persona as one size fits all. And in a world where younger generations and young writers are often much more intersectional, I wanted to offer a word of caution that you can create complexity on the page with more than just this concept of master. And like I kept thinking, well, now what do I do if I can't use my master and minor identities? How am I going to create complexity? And that was when I realized that for intersectional writers, you can slow down. Like I ended up doing the coming of age where all I was the child on the page from a very young age until around when I was 18. None of my life experiences beyond that period were introduced into the story. And I thought, is this going to be too simple? And at first I didn't want to do it. And then I realized, well, why don't I want to do it? And I thought, well, it's because I want to convince people that I'm more than I once was. And then I realized that there was a component of shame in that, and I didn't want to feel ashamed. And then I remembered that Zora Neale Hurston had said, what did she say? She said, if you're silent, they'll kill you and they'll say you enjoyed it. And then I realized, well, if I combined histories, American histories, into this story of my childhood, governmental policies, if I weave in all of this little known facts about what it means to be Native American, I'm creating an indictment of greed in this country through my grandparents' generation into my own. And that context made it feel good. But I was still wondering, like, how in the world do I create some sort of contradiction in self if I can't use the full scope of who I am? And what I realized is that um, it's not only your master and minor identities that are available to you in creating a multitudinous self, you can slow down and examine your motivations and contradictory behaviors. And you begin to see that almost all character traits exist on a spectrum from good to bad. And I've just given you a few of those right here in this slide for you to think about. So, when we think about rampant humility, right, we understand that it leads to self degradation, while a deficiency of humility leads to excessive pride. Excessive discernment becomes judgmentalism, while a lack of discernment makes us foolish. Over the top love becomes enablement, but when it's lacking, it results in selfishness. There are attitudes that we contain within that offer sufficient complexity without us jumping out of time if we're hewing in to a period of our life. And to be clear, the difference between an autobiography and a memoir is often that a memoir is a sliver of time that deals in a failure, and an autobiography is a larger scope that deals in successes and shows people how you've pulled yourself up by your bootstraps. And that's kind of the difference between what I thought I was doing and what I ended up doing. The book that I wrote ended up being a lot more human, I think, in that it addresses a lot of the struggles that I had as a child. Um, I want to end on or I want to do another writing assignment that kind of emerges from the story that I just told you about finding complexity in motivations and behaviors versus digressive pushes towards different periods of our life. And this one will celebrate the idea of the curmudgeon or the contrarian in the history of the essay. So, in the history of the essay, there's a very common sort of voice that emerges from the 1500s onward, where you have people who write in a voice. I misspelled contrarian in my slideshow. That is not afraid of swimming upstream in the opposite direction of society, right? And I think we have all had times in our life when we feel out of step with society. In fact, I would even argue that the writer is a person who is often in a liminal stance, by which I mean standing in the doorway on a threshold, kind of looking at one room and looking at the other and having a vantage point on two worlds, but not never really fitting in either, right? You always kind of feel like you're a little bit of an outsider. And by virtue of being an outsider, you can see, you have sight, you're able to criticize, you're able to applaud, you're able to be set apart. And so the last prompt that I wanted to give you was to write about a time in your life when you were misunderstood, right? When people make wrong assumptions about you. And to jot down some ideas about what it felt like to be misunderstood. And the full essay would allow you space to talk about how you could set that record straight by writing about the event, right? I told you the story of the neighbor and when I was in Italy, who came and told me that he couldn't believe I was who I said I was. In telling that story to you today, I have reclaimed my control over this time when I felt misperceived. And so you might want to screenshot this. It kind of the prompts asks you, who are you with? Are you alone? What happens? How does it make you feel to have people misperceive you? And if you guys could jot down a few sentences, perhaps about a time when you felt that sort of outsiderness right now, that would be excellent. And then I would love to hear some of you, maybe if you wanted to share what that was. I'll just give you a minute or two. Could you ask her to clarify major and minor identities? No, no, I don't know that if Vivian Gornick uses that in her book explicitly. I can't remember. It's been so long since I've read it. It's like, I have a list of identities that feel really central to my life, right? They're a big part of who I am. I'm a mother. My identity as a mother is way more important than my identity, for example, as a yogi, right? Um, ironically for me, I'm half Mexican or Latinx and half indigenous. My identity as an indigenous person has always been stronger. That's the community that I have felt more at home in than my mother's Hispanic community for whatever reason. I think we have, there are ways in which maybe there could be somebody who's a brother who feels like it's really, really important, that role to him. He's the eldest brother, while another person who's a brother barely thinks about the significance of being a brother. It's not something that feels very important to him. Maybe for him, his identity as a lawyer is really, really important. So the master identities would be the ones that we privilege, and the minor are ones that we don't think of as often. What's important is that we begin to think of ourselves as being multiple people that have different perspectives on any given event in our lives. So the way I would talk about, say, January 6th to my children, if they're 5 years old, might be very different than the way I would talk about it with my girlfriends. And that would matter in a story because the lens through which we're seeing our world creates the voice that we speak with. And if you want to read more about it, I mean, you could read Vivian Gornick. You could read the entire essay by Philip Lopate, what the on creating a character of the self, I think it's called. I can send it to Narrative 4 and they can forward it out, the entire essay, to whoever was in this class, perhaps. Does anybody want to talk about what they came up with in this prompt where we're talking about people who have made wrong assumptions about you or misperceived you? Does anybody want to share?
I had, I'm sorry, I had one. I used to live in the States. I live in Ireland now, and the security person going through security in Dublin was like, "Oh, your name's McLaughlin, just like me, but wait, your name is spelt wrong. Um, did you lose the U when you went through Ellis Island?" And I was like, "No, no, no, I'm from Ireland." And she was like,
Yeah.
yeah, right, you are.
Oh,
You're not from." But I'm like,
God.
I'm born and bred there. It's just so it was just a
Yeah.
complete. an identity kind of confusion, you know? So, yeah.
Yeah, and also it's a little bit wounding maybe, like, don't
Oh,
tell
yeah.
me that I'm not from where
To
I'm from.
yeah, totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah. Anybody else? Is a very good one. Thank you for sharing.
I like to share mine. Um,
Yes.
in 2008, I went to Cuba, and in front of the hotel, a Cuban man asked me, this is all in Spanish. He asked me, "Where are you from?" And when I said I was from the United States, he spat on the floor. And something
Oh.
told me, something told me to tell him, "But I'm Boricua." And he said,
Uh-huh.
"Oh, so then I forgive you." And
Oh.
then I asked him, "I'm the same person you're talking to." And he said, "The reason I said I forgive you, because Puerto Rico and Cuba," he said, "this again, all in Spanish, uh, they're one bird with the two wings from the same bird. So we
Mm.
are family." But it was striking to
Yeah.
experience.
Great. I mean, that's a wonderful story. I can relate. I mean, I have traveled. When I was traveling in West Africa one time, people were getting mad at me because I was American. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm
Yeah.
Native American. Don't do that. So those moments, I've heard people say, I don't know any way in which I feel like an outsider. And I tell them, you're not digging deep enough. Imagine somebody whose sexuality is not apparent by looking at them. I had an older woman one time who was from Manhattan and grew up and then she finally found hers, and hers was that she was online dating in her 70s, and that it was like not, technologically she felt out of step.
Oh,
Also,
yeah.
her kids were making fun of her because she's trying to date as an older woman, right? And I had a kid one time in Iowa who looked like an Iowa farm boy. And when he wrote his essay on this topic, it floored me because he had grown up in a Mexican barrio in Los Angeles. And so by his appearance, I thought he fit in wonderfully in Iowa and had never had an experience of feeling out of step with society when in fact he had. So thinking about the ways in which you are both contrarian and outsider is a great place to identify the beginning point for any sort of essay. Thank you all for logging in. It was great to talk to you today.